These are some of my best tips for playing on controller in Apex. If you implement even some of these tips into your gameplay, you're not only going to improve your aim and your movement, but your overall comfortability of playing on controller should be much better too. So let's get into it. First up, you need the right controller sensitivity. And by far, the two most popular controller sense are 4-4 Classic and 4-3 Linear with no dead zone. Now, both of these are two of the most popular controller sensitivities out there. Pros, high-level creators, they all swear by either one or the other. There's also a good amount of creators who talk about advanced look controls, and while certain controller players have found these to be successful, there is way more fine-tuning involved with advanced look controls, which makes it much more difficult to find the right fit for you. It's been my experience that about 98% of the controller player base will be better off with either 4-4 Classic or 4-3 Classic if they really want to, but also 4-3 Linear, no dead zone. When it comes to 4-4 Classic, I use a small dead zone, but dead zone is really going to come down to how long you've had your controller, does it have a good amount of stick drift, and how do you like the feel of that when it comes to your aim. A smaller dead zone allows for some better aim control. No dead zone, I feel like my sticks drift all over the place. It makes it a little tough with the camera floating up in the air and not being more centered where I need it to be. Regarding some settings that I think are mandatory to change in order to find some success, put your field of view at least 100. I play on 110, which is the max. This allows for a more zoomed out perspective, allowing for better peripheral vision. This will allow for you to see better targets at range, particularly on your left or your right, but also at some distance away from you. Vibration off, this is a preference, but I don't think it's worth it in this shooter game because I find it to be way too distracting and I don't really need that type of feedback on the controller itself. Auto sprint on, this will allow for your controller, particularly its left stick, to see more longevity. If you're always clicking that thing down, it can cause a good amount of wear and tear on it. Button layout is a preference, but a very popular one, especially if you hold the controller normally and you don't play claw, is button puncher. I use that, and I don't use any paddles, which I know a lot of players do, but it's just a preference for me for how I've used controller for so many years now. If you don't use paddles, I recommend putting crouch on toggle rather than hold, but if you have paddles, putting crouch on hold can be much better. It can allow for some bunny hopping and other movement tech that incorporate the crouch. Let's shift into some movement. Now, movement is a core component to Apex, as I'm sure most of you know, and on controller, doing certain movement techniques is either not possible or extremely difficult. First one that is the most obvious is slide jumping. For any newer players, you want to press crouch, make sure you're moving forward, and then press jump. This will allow for you to maneuver around the map much more smoothly. It's really simple to do, and once you got that down, you want to learn about edge sliding. This is where you slide off of an edge and create more momentum forward, either towards another piece of cover, towards an enemy. It's really multifaceted, but it's important to incorporate because if you can land in a crouch and then slide off of whatever that piece of terrain is, you'll create more momentum, making yourself less predictable and could allow for some better outplay. Another popular movement tech is wall bouncing. Now, so many players know how to wall bounce these days, but they really don't incorporate it a heck of a lot in their fights. In order to wall bounce, what you want to do is go at the wall at an angle, slide, jump, look towards the wall, jump again, and look away from the wall. This takes a little bit of practice, and certain pieces of terrain or certain walls, it might think you're trying to mantle it, and if so, you're probably jumping too close to the wall or too far away from the wall. Each piece of terrain that you wall bounce off of will require some degree of geometry, I guess. I don't know. I skipped that class in high school, but you got to get it figured out when it comes to different walls because it's not always going to be the same thing. However, the technique is, and once you learn to do this, start doing it throughout your matches. Do it all over the place because once you do that, then your brain will start to connect doing it in a fight. And when you do it in a fight, a lot of players will get surprised, and hopefully that will help you get the first blow on them while they don't necessarily know exactly what's happening. There's also another aspect to wall bouncing called fatigue wall bouncing. And this is where you basically wall bounce while you're standing still. You don't need to slide or jump into the wall. Like with a normal wall bounce, what you want to do is spam jump twice and then either move your left stick forward or backward depending on what you're trying to do with the wall bounce. Like if I want to wall bounce something and peek an enemy, then I will obviously move my left stick forward after I do the double jump. If I want to back up because I'm trying to do it in combat and I'm making myself more unpredictable, then obviously I'd press backwards. Fatigue wall bouncing is another mechanic that all controller players can implement into their gameplay, and it's a pretty broken mechanic when done correctly. A lot of enemies are not used to this, and it's not something that you'll see in most of your matches. However, if you're able to get this technique down, down, you will see very quickly how helpful it can be. Now, I'm sure zip lines are on your mind since I brought up movement, and interacting on zip lines can be kind of complex, especially on controller. But a zip line super jump is very practical to learn, and it's pretty easy. What you want to do is hit interact and then spam jump twice. You must be on the ground when doing this. You cannot jump first or be midair and trying to do this. You will not get the super jump, but you can use this mechanic in several different areas. Obviously in the zipline buildings or in any building that has a zipline that's vertical. You can do it on horizontal zip lines like Pathfinders or map-made zip lines. You can even do it on the zip rails. And you can also fling yourself up and on top of the post that holds up the zip line or the zip rail. And once again, this will allow for some outplay on your opponents. So it's interact, jump, jump. If you use paddles, I've coached several players who have said this is really difficult with paddles, but it takes some time to get that double input on the jump. However, once you got it, same thing with the wall bounce. Start incorporating it into your gameplay. Do it whenever you can, practice it, get better at it, and then start thinking about doing it in combat. Now, moving on to some other controller tips that are necessary. Because our interact button does so many things in Apex, and for me, my interact button is X, so it'll do things like open or close a door, reload my weapon, interact with the death box, interact with certain abilities, zip lines, on and on, right? And at times when you want to do one interaction, you might end up doing a different interaction if you're in a position where it's possible. For instance, you may want to reload on the door while it's closed and wind up opening the door. Now, there is a setting where you can change what your interact button does, like tap to use or hold to reload, and this can differentiate what your interact button does at different times. However, if you're like me and you don't like to use this setting, then really just focus on where your camera is. So with your right stick, if you're on a door and you're trying to reload, maybe you just do a 180, look behind you, and you'll have the reload option as opposed to open the door option. It's the same thing with a catalyst cue or a caustic trap or a Watson fence, anything that, is your own ability that you can interact with. Sometimes if you quickly hit reload, you may wind up diffusing one of those abilities. But just remember, if you can look a little bit slower and be a little bit more mindful, you'll be able to do both without screwing up one another. Next is the heal wheel. Now, for me, this is up on the D-pad, and I've talked about this for years now, but the game will put you on syringes. You need to manually switch it to shields, particularly batteries if you have them. This not only will keep your brain more in line with, hey, what is my heal inventory right now? Like, do I have enough health? Do I have enough shields? But it'll also prepare you for when you take damage, you can just press up on the D-pad and begin your healing process. I've coached hundreds of players who don't do this, and then they pause when they take damage, they stand still for an extra second, they start the wrong heal, they try to figure out what heal they need to be on, and all of that precious time where the opponent ends up killing them. Apex is a game of seconds. If you correctly learn to use the heal wheel and you make it muscle memory, you will be a sweat in no time, honestly. All right, shifting a little bit into looting. Controller players have a very difficult time when it comes to looting. Why? Because they're stuck standing still. Mouse and keyboard players, they can move and loot. And this makes looting way more dynamic and can actually create a ton of outplay because they are able to get quick armor swaps. They're able to quickly snatch stuff out of a death box while never being a stagnant target. And for controller, it's not even close to the same thing. But there are a few things we can do. First is jump in the death box. And what you want to do is begin the interact into the death box and then time your jump quickly after. This will allow for one singular jump as you're going into the death box, but you won't be standing still and you're able to get an armor swap very quickly if you practice this. Of course, you can grab other things, but it's going to be most helpful for those armor swapping moments. You can also crouch in a death box once you've entered it, but you're not going to be able to move left or right, so it's not incredibly useful. However, at times, I guess it could be. And lastly, you are able to run and interact with the death box, but it's going to kick you out pretty quickly. I don't really use this ever because it's going to kick me out and because the timing of it is a little wonky. You need to make sure that your auto sprint is on and that you're running and you're interacting, but you started the interaction right when you possibly could. And by the time you probably pass the box by a foot, you'll be in it and you'll be able to quickly grab something, but then it's going to automatically kick you out of the death box because you've ran past the imaginary zone in which you can interact with the death box. But those are the three ways we can move and loot, if you want to call it that. But I think the most practical one and the most efficient one is the jump into the death box. Now let's shift to some tactical tips when it comes to just aiming and fighting in general. First is strafing. Use your left stick to move left or right or both to incorporate a nice strafe into your gameplay. Apex is not a shooter where you always want to be standing still and being a stagnant target. As I said, movement is a huge part of this game. Getting a good strafe down is really, really important. And yes, you can incorporate some crouching while you're strafing in order order to make you a harder target to hit. However, strafing is not a one-size-fits-all thing, meaning a lot of our strafe should be contingent on what our opponent is doing or not doing, and also what weapons we are currently using. Certain weapons, when you aim down sights with them, will have a much slower strafing speed than others. However, when you're not aiming down your sights, every weapon moves at the same speed when you strafe. So while hip firing, whether you have a Spitfire or a Wingman, you're moving at the same speed. That's not true when you aim down your sights. The most popular type of strafe is mirroring. It's where you move left and your opponent also moves left, or they move right and you move right. This will make tracking them very, very easy, but you must make the read on what side or direction they're moving in and be able to counter it with the same one. You can also do an opposite strafe, which I find to be very efficient. While you move left and they move right, you're kind of circling one another. And if you're up close while using an SMG, you will find a lot of success here. But what about hip firing? Well, hip firing is sort of a dying art in Apex these days. The last year, they've made it certainly not as good as it used to be, and there are some weapons that they've altered when it comes to the hip fire specifically. So first, if you're within 8 meters or less, hip firing is still widely applicable. Depending on the weapon that you have though, some weapons are certainly not going to be as good as others. I will categorize all the SMGs, whether you have laser sights or not, which assist with hip firing. I will still hip fire within 8 meters or less of my opponent. When it comes to ARs, I probably have to be more like 6 meters or less, but it's going to depend on how they're moving and where my shot is beginning. The AR hip fire nerf that they made in season 15, I believe, or 16, has really messed up how efficient ARs can be up close. Burst guns, the Nemesis and the Hemlock right now are the best weapons to hip fire with in the AR class. LMGs, LMGs also have been nerfed heavily the past year and a half. You can still hip fire with them within that range as well, similar to ARs, but you got to be careful with them. And then for the shotgun class, it really is going to depend on which one you have. If I have the EVA 8, yeah, I'll hip fire that in 5 meters or less. But all of the other shotguns, I prefer to ADS, especially if I'm up close. The Mastiff and the Peacekeeper both have built-in chokes, which help with the blast pattern, making the shot more of a slug, and that can just be way better for me when I'm up close to my opponent. Of course, if someone's right in my face, like 1 to 2 meters, and reacting to them while ADSing isn't going to work, I'll hip fire. But by and far, with most shotguns, I'm going to ADS. Now, a lot of players have come to learn about recoil smoothing. Plenty of you still probably won't know what this is, but it's the art of strafing while firing an automatic weapon and smoothing out the recoil. It's a built-in mechanic in Apex that has come to light over the last year. This is especially true in 50 meters or less, and for certain weapons, it can be easier to accomplish. Other weapons, not so much. When you see a player moving left or right while firing and still controlling the recoil somewhat, it may look like they have no recoil at all. This is basically what recoil smoothing looks like. And it definitely is a skill because, like I said, it works within a certain range and other guns are just not going to be as easy to do with it. But if you're able to practice this, you should become more efficient at those medium to close range encounters with automatic weapons. But this is only when you're aiming down your sights. Keep that in mind. And lastly, for all controller players in general, look for close range fights if you want to be efficient with your shots. Don't waste too much time in long range engagements. And I know I should clarify because yes, at times it will be necessary to engage at a distance, especially if you have a ranged weapon. But this should not be the majority of your battles. It's not just because of aim assist. It's also because longer range engagements require much more time for the battle to finish. There's going to be way more sound of this battle going on, which allows for way more third-party opportunities, and it's often very difficult to complete the fight altogether. You could get a knock at 80 meters with a longbow, but you still have to get that finish in order to get that kill. Aim assist is strong in Apex, okay? There's no two ways around it. Use this to your advantage right now, and I know mouse and keyboard players will be mad at me for saying this, but if you want to be efficient, you got to look for close range engagements. If you enjoyed this video and you want to learn all about 2 crucial tips for every legend in Apex, I suggest you check out this video next. Thanks for watching. Peace.